in the quiet, picturesque town of Leavenworth, Washington, where rolling hills stretched toward the horizon and cobblestone streets whispered of old-world charm. The violent death of 52-year-old Victor Halstead shattered the town's serene facade. It was the kind of place where people smiled at each other on the street, where the appearance of perfect lives masked the shadows lurking just beneath the surface. What at first seemed like a tragic yet mysterious death of a wealthy businessman slowly unraveled into something far darker, a twisted tale of control, obsession, and a marriage that spiraled into murder. At the center of it all was an unlikely love affair, one that had once captivated the entire town. Adrian Cole, a handsome and driven young boy, had married Victor Halstead, a wealthy businessman way older than him. Their union had been the subject of fascination. People whispered about it over dinner parties, marveled at how Victor, with all his wealth and power, had fallen for someone so young and vibrant. Adrian had brought a new energy into Victor's life, and their love story had seemed like something out of a dream. But like many dreams, it eventually turned into a nightmare. Victor Halstead was no ordinary man. A self-made millionaire, he had built his empire with ruthless determination. In Leavenworth, he was admired and envied in equal measure. His wealth afforded him influence, and his charm made him seem almost untouchable. When Victor met Adrian, it was as if the universe had conspired to bring two opposites together. Adrian was the kind of a person who could light up a room with his smile, full of youth, ambition, and creativity. Victor, on the other hand, was calculating, methodical, and always in control. Their connection was instant. Adrian, with his boundless energy, seemed to breathe new life into Victor's carefully constructed world. The romance that bloomed between them was nothing short of electrifying. Adrian had been swept off his feet by Victor's charm and generosity. Weekends were spent traveling to far-flung places, Paris, Tokyo, the Amalfi Coast, where the couple indulged in luxury, their every whim catered to. Victor showered Adrian with expensive gifts, designer clothes, rare art pieces, even a sleek sports car that became the talk of the town. For a time, it seemed perfect. Adrian was captivated by the whirlwind of passion, and Victor, who had spent years alone, finally felt alive again. But there's always more to the story. Beneath the surface, something darker was lurking. After a year of blissful romance, Victor proposed. It wasn't a grand romantic gesture like Adrian might have expected, but a conversation held over dinner one evening in the grand dining room of Victor's estate. There was no candlelight, no music, just Victor's steady, unwavering gaze as he slid a small velvet box across the table. "We should get married," Victor had said, his tone calm but firm. "It's the logical next step. You're already a part of my life in every way that matters. Let's make it official." Adrian had been stunned. Marriage? It wasn't something he had thought about, at least not with Victor. Their relationship had always been exciting and passionate, but marriage felt so permanent, so final. There was a moment of hesitation, a flicker of uncertainty in Adrian's eyes that Victor didn't miss. But how could Adrian say no? Victor had given him everything: security, adventure, a life that he never thought possible. And deep down, Adrian had loved him. At least he thought he did. So, with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, Adrian had said yes. The wedding was a grand affair, the kind that the town of Leavenworth had never seen before. Held at Victor's sprawling estate, the guest list was a who's who of business tycoons, politicians, and social elites. Adrian had felt out of place in the middle of it all, but he played the part of the happy groom, standing beside Victor as they exchanged vows under a sky painted in gold by the setting sun. But even then, a small voice in the back of Adrian's mind warned him that something was off. It wasn't just the grandeur of it all, it was Victor. There was something possessive in the way he looked at Adrian, something that made him feel less like a partner and more like an acquisition. The first cracks in their marriage appeared almost immediately. In the beginning, Victor had been attentive, loving even. But after the wedding, something shifted. It was subtle at first. Victor would make offhand comments about how Adrian should spend more time at the estate, how he didn't need to go out with friends so often. Soon the suggestions became demands. Victor, who had always been controlling in subtle ways, became more overt in his need to dominate every aspect of Adrian's life. Adrian, who had once thrived on his independence, began to feel suffocated. He had always dreamed of opening his own art gallery, of creating something that was entirely his. But every time he brought it up, Victor would shut it down. "Why would you want to do that?" Victor asked one evening, his voice low and dismissive. "You don't need to work, Adrian. I can give you anything you want." "I don't need your money, Victor," Adrian replied, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "I want to do this on my own." Victor's eyes narrowed, his expression turning cold. "Why struggle when I can provide for you? What do you think you'll find out there that you don't already have with me?" It wasn't just about the gallery. Over time, Victor's control seeped into every corner of their lives. He decided who they would see, where they would go, what Adrian could and couldn't do. Adrian, who had once been so full of life, began to feel like a prisoner in the marriage. The love that had once been so intoxicating now felt like a chain around his neck. Victor's need for control didn't stop with Adrian's life. It extended to his every movement. He began to track Adrian's whereabouts, hiring private investigators to follow him whenever he left the house. Adrian noticed the surveillance, felt the eyes on him when he was out. But Victor always denied it, brushing off Adrian's concerns with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "He's suffocating me," Adrian confided one evening to his best friend, Soren. They had known each other since childhood, their bond as strong as ever despite the changes in Adrian's life. Soren had never liked Victor. There was always something about him that made Soren uneasy. "You need to get out," Soren said, his voice urgent. "This isn't normal, Adrian. He's not going to let you go, not without a fight." But leaving Victor wasn't that simple. He had his claws deep in Adrian's life, financially, emotionally, even socially. Victor's connections ran deep, and Adrian knew that if he left, he would be starting from scratch. Worse, he feared what Victor might do if he ever tried to walk away. And then there was the marriage. It wasn't just a relationship. It was a contract, a legal bond that tied Adrian to Victor in ways that went beyond love. Walking away from Victor meant walking away from everything. But the more Adrian tried to pull away, the tighter Victor's grip became. Victor's obsession grew with each passing day. He started showing up unannounced at places where Adrian thought he could find some space. At Soren's loft, at the art studio, Adrian had started visiting again. Every time Adrian thought he could breathe, Victor was there, watching, waiting, and there was always more. Victor wasn't just controlling Adrian, he was controlling the people around him. Soren had started receiving anonymous threats, strange phone calls in the middle of the night. It didn't take long for Adrian to realize that Victor was behind it all. He had always been a man who got what he wanted, and what he wanted now was Adrian. All of him. "You think you can just walk away from me?" Victor had asked one night, his voice low and dangerous. They were standing in the grand foyer of the mansion, the cold marble floors echoing Adrian's footsteps as he tried to leave. "Do you have any idea what I can do to you? To your precious little friends?" Adrian's blood ran cold. Victor had always hinted at his power, his connections, but now it was out in the open. The threat wasn't just implied, it was real. "I'm not afraid of you," Adrian said, but his voice wavered, betraying the fear that was beginning to take root in his heart. Victor stepped closer, his eyes dark and unblinking. "You should be." From that moment on, Adrian knew there was no turning back. He had to get out, had to find a way to escape Victor's tightening grip before it was too late. But Victor was always one step ahead, always watching, waiting for the moment when Adrian would try to run. And when that moment came, the consequences would be deadly. The days that followed Victor's veiled threat were a blur for Adrian. His once vibrant life had become a narrow tunnel, with walls closing in on all sides. Each day he felt more trapped, more suffocated by the man he had once loved. He had always known that Victor was a controlling figure, but he hadn't fully grasped the depths of his possessiveness until now. Every step Adrian took was monitored. His phone was tapped, his conversations carefully listened to, and every move he made was shadowed by the ever-watchful eyes of Victor's hired investigators. It was no longer a marriage. It was a prison. A gilded, beautifully furnished prison, but a prison nonetheless. Adrian's art became his only solace. He began spending more time in his studio, using painting and sketching as a means to escape the overwhelming control that consumed his life. But, even there, Victor's presence lingered. The walls of the studio began to feel just as constricting as the mansion, because Victor always knew. He always knew where Adrian was, what he was doing. The sense of being hunted, of being prey, grew stronger with each passing day. Victor, for his part, began to grow more erratic. His once cool, calculated demeanor was cracking, giving way to sudden bursts of anger and irrational jealousy. It didn't matter that Adrian was always by his side. Victor was convinced that Adrian was plotting to leave him, or worse, to be with someone else. Adrian tried to keep up the facade, to maintain some semblance of normalcy. But the stress of living under Victor's oppressive gaze began to show. He lost weight, his face growing gaunt, his once bright eyes dulled by exhaustion. Friends who hadn't seen him in months were shocked by the change, and whispers began to spread through Leavenworth. "He's not the same," they would say at dinner parties. "What happened to him? It's like he's a ghost of the man he used to be." But Victor didn't care about the whispers. In fact, he thrived on them. The more isolated Adrian became, the more dependent on Victor he would have to be. Or so Victor thought. Adrian, however, had begun planning his escape. He hadn't told anyone, not even Soren, about his plans. Victor's reach was too long, too deep. Adrian was terrified that if he confided in anyone, Victor would find out before he could make his move. And so, he began taking small, calculated steps. He quietly opened a separate bank account under a false name, depositing small amounts of cash from the art pieces he sold under the radar. It wasn't much, but it was enough to get him out of Leavenworth, enough to disappear. But Victor wasn't blind to the subtle changes in Adrian's behavior. He could feel the distance growing, like a thread slowly unraveling between them. And the more Victor sensed Adrian slipping away, the more desperate he became to hold on to him. One evening, as they sat in the lavish living room of their estate, Victor finally confronted Adrian about his suspicions. "Do you love me, Adrian?" Victor asked, his voice deceptively soft, as if the answer didn't matter. But his eyes were sharp, penetrating. He watched Adrian with an intensity that made his skin crawl. Adrian hesitated, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew this was a test. He had seen this look before, the one Victor wore just before his temper flared. Lying to him would be dangerous, but the truth was far worse. "Of course I do," Adrian replied, forcing a smile. "Why would you even ask that?" Victor didn't respond right away. Instead, he leaned forward, clasping his hands together as he studied Adrian's face. "Because I think you're hiding something from me. I think you're trying to leave." The words hung in the air like a noose tightening around Adrian's neck. He felt his stomach drop, panic surging through his veins. How had Victor figured it out? He had been so careful, so meticulous in his planning. "I'm not leaving you, Victor," Adrian said quickly, his voice shaky. "You're imagining things. I'm just stressed, that's all, with the gallery plans and everything." "There are no gallery plans, Adrian." Victor cut him off, his tone suddenly sharp. "You don't need a gallery. You have me. I provide for you, don't I? You don't need anything else." Adrian swallowed hard, the air in the room growing thick and suffocating. This was it, the moment he had feared. He realized now that there would be no escape, no life without Victor unless he made a drastic decision. Victor stood up, walking slowly over to Adrian, his shadow looming large as he approached. "You're mine, Adrian. You understand that, don't you? There is no life for you without me. You can't survive without me." Adrian nodded, the words sticking in his throat. "I know." But Victor wasn't satisfied with the answer. He grabbed Adrian by the chin, forcing him to look up into his eyes. "Say it," he demanded, his grip tightening. "Say you'll never leave me?" "I'll never leave you," Adrian whispered, tears welling in his eyes. Victor released his grip, satisfied with Adrian's submission, for now. But that moment, that chilling confrontation, solidified something in Adrian. He knew now that he couldn't stay. It wasn't just about his freedom anymore. It was about survival. Victor's obsession had turned dangerous, and it was only a matter of time before something terrible happened. That night, after Victor had fallen asleep, Adrian made his final decision. He would leave, and he would do it soon. The following days were a delicate dance of pretending and planning. Adrian knew that one wrong move could set Victor off, so he was careful not to give away any signs of his intentions. But inside, the fear gnawed at him. Every time Victor touched him, every time he smiled that controlling smile, Adrian felt a sense of dread wash over him. He could feel the clock ticking down, each moment bringing him closer to his escape, or to disaster. Soren had started noticing Adrian's increased anxiety, the way he seemed constantly on edge. One afternoon, while they sat in the studio, Soren finally confronted him. "What's going on, Adrian? You look like you're about to break." Adrian hesitated, knowing that telling Soren the truth would put him in danger, but he couldn't hold it in any longer. "I'm leaving him, Soren," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I've been planning it for weeks, but you can't tell anyone, not a soul." Soren's eyes widened in shock. "Adrian, are you sure that's a good idea? You know what he's capable of." "I don't have a choice," Adrian replied, his voice shaking. "If I stay, he'll destroy me. He's already threatened you, Soren. I can't let him do that. I have to leave before it's too late." Soren looked at him for a long moment before nodding slowly. "Okay, but you need to be careful. Victor won't let you go easily." "I know," Adrian said, his heart heavy with the weight of the truth. "I know." The plan was set. Adrian would leave that weekend, while Victor was away on a business trip. It was the only chance he would have. Everything had been prepared. The new bank account, the packed bags hidden in the studio, the flight booked under a false name. All he had to do was make it to the airport. But there was more. Victor, ever watchful, had already begun to sense that something was wrong. He could feel it in the way Adrian avoided his touch, the way he smiled less and less, and Victor wasn't the type of man to ignore his instincts. As the weekend approached, Victor's behavior grew more erratic. He began questioning Adrian about every little thing, asking where he had been, who he had seen. The control that had once been subtle was now suffocating, and Adrian felt like he was walking a tightrope, one wrong step away from disaster. And then, on the eve of his planned escape, Victor did something unexpected. "I'm canceling the trip," Victor announced over dinner, his eyes locked on Adrian. "I've decided to stay home this weekend." Adrian's heart stopped. This wasn't part of the plan. Without Victor's absence, there would be no escape, no chance to get away unnoticed. But Victor wasn't done. "I think we need to spend more time together," he said slowly, his voice low and ominous. "We've been growing apart lately, don't you think?" Adrian nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. "Yes, maybe." Victor smiled, a slow, dangerous smile. "Good. Then we'll stay home. Together." Adrian's mind raced. He was trapped. The plan was falling apart and Victor was tightening his grip. There was no way out. But the story didn't end here. Because what Adrian didn't know was that the final confrontation was coming, and it would be more brutal than he could have ever imagined. That night, Adrian couldn't sleep. His mind raced with panic, the reality of Victor's escalating control pressing down on him like a weight he couldn't lift. The plan had crumbled, and with Victor canceling his trip, there would be no escape. The next morning, the atmosphere in the house was suffocating. Victor's every word felt like a test, every glance carrying an undercurrent of suspicion. Adrian went through the motions, but inside he was spiraling. He could feel the walls closing in, the ticking of an unseen clock counting down his last moments of freedom. It was after dinner that night when the final shift occurred. They sat in silence at the table, Victor watching Adrian with a calm intensity that made his skin crawl. "I've been thinking," Victor said, his voice slow and measured. "Maybe it's time we took a break from the outside world. Just you and me. No distractions." Adrian's heart sank. This wasn't a suggestion. It was another lock on the cage. "You need time to remember what's important, Adrian. United States. I can see it slipping away." Victor's eyes darkened, and his hand reached across the table, gripping Adrian's with a strength that sent a wave of dread through him. Adrian couldn't breathe. He couldn't see a way out. The urgency to leave, to escape, pulsed in his veins. But Victor was too close, too powerful. There was no way to fight back, not at this moment. Victor stood and walked around the table, stopping behind Adrian's chair. His hand rested on Adrian's shoulder, deceptively gentle. "There's no need to worry, my love. I'll take care of everything." Adrian's pulse raced. He could feel Victor's breath on his neck, feel the chill that followed his words. The escape plan was dead, but his instinct to survive was not. And yet, it wasn't time for the final blow. Not yet. The tension in the mansion had reached a boiling point. Victor's behavior had become increasingly erratic, his once subtle control morphing into something far more overt and terrifying. Adrian felt the weight of Victor's eyes on him constantly, scrutinizing his every movement. There was no longer any pretense of love, just possession. Every breath Adrian took felt like borrowed time, each second a countdown toward an inevitable confrontation. It was during one of their suffocating dinners that the final cracks began to show. Victor's mood had been unpredictable all day, shifting between bouts of affection and sharp, biting comments that left Adrian on edge. He had grown quiet, cold, as if calculating something unseen. They sat across from each other in the vast dining room, the candlelight casting long shadows on the marble floors, amplifying the suffocating silence. "I think it's time we made some changes," Victor said suddenly, his voice steady but laced with something dangerous. Adrian's heart skipped a beat. He knew what that meant. Another attempt to tighten the chains. Another way to keep him locked in place. "What do you mean?" Adrian asked carefully, trying to maintain the facade of calm. Victor smiled, but there was no warmth behind it. "I've decided you need to stay here longer. The outside world is distracting you. It's time for us to focus on what's important. Our life, our marriage." The air felt thick, heavy. Adrian could feel his pulse quicken, panic bubbling under the surface. "Victor, I can't just—" "You can," Victor interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument. "And you will. I've been patient, Adrian, but I can see what's happening. You're slipping away from me, and I won't allow it." Adrian's stomach twisted into knots. He had been planning his escape for weeks, carefully avoiding suspicion. But now, with Victor growing more erratic, more controlling, Adrian realized that he had miscalculated. Victor was already onto him. The confrontation came sooner than Adrian had anticipated. Later that night, as the house settled into a deep, unnatural silence, Adrian stood by the window in their bedroom, staring out into the darkness. He had been gathering the courage to leave, one last attempt to run before Victor tightened the noose completely. Victor entered the room quietly, his presence oppressive. Adrian didn't have to turn around to know he was there. The tension in the air thickened and Adrian's heart raced. He could feel it. The moment was coming. "I see what you're trying to do." Victor's voice was low, calm, too calm. Adrian turned, trying to feign ignorance, but the look on Victor's face told him that it was too late. Victor knew. He had always known. "You're planning to leave me," Victor continued, stepping closer. "Do you really think you can just walk away? After everything I've done for you?" Adrian backed away, his breath shallow. "Victor, it's not like that. I just need space." "There is no space," Victor snapped, his calm exterior cracking. "You belong to me. There is no life for you without me." Adrian's back hit the wall, the cold marble pressing against him as Victor loomed over him, his face twisted in anger. "You think you can just run?" Victor hissed, his voice filled with venom. "You think I'll let you go?" Panic surged through Adrian. He could see the madness in Victor's eyes, the obsessive need to control, to possess. There was no reasoning with him. The man Adrian had once loved was gone, replaced by someone far more dangerous. "You'll never be free of me," Victor growled, grabbing Adrian's wrist with crushing force. "I own you." Adrian's mind raced, his pulse hammering in his ears. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think. In that moment, survival instincts took over. His eyes darted around the room, landing on a heavy iron sculpture Victor had bought during one of their trips abroad. Without hesitation, Adrian yanked his wrist free and lunged for the sculpture, gripping it tightly in his hands. His vision blurred with fear and desperation as he turned back toward Victor. "Adrian!" Victor started, but it was too late. With all the strength he had, Adrian swung the sculpture toward Victor's head. The impact was brutal, the sound of metal against bone echoing through the room. Victor's eyes widened in shock, and for a split second, time seemed to freeze. Then he collapsed, crumpling to the floor with a sickening thud. Adrian stood there, gasping for breath, the sculpture still clutched in his trembling hands. His heart pounded violently in his chest, adrenaline surging through his veins. Victor wasn't moving, but it wasn't over. Victor groaned, his body twitching as he struggled to push himself up. Adrian's heart lurched. He wasn't dead. Not yet. Panic surged through him again. If Victor got back up, there would be no escape. He would never stop. Adrian knew that this was his only chance to truly be free. With shaking hands, Adrian gripped the sculpture again. His mind screamed at him to stop, to run, to do anything but what he was about to do. But the instinct to survive was stronger than anything else. Tears streamed down his face as he raised the sculpture high above his head. "I'm sorry," Adrian whispered, his voice breaking. And with that, he brought the sculpture down again, harder this time. The impact reverberated through the room, followed by the final, awful sound of Victor's body going limp. His eyes, once filled with rage and madness, stared lifelessly at the ceiling. It was over. Victor was dead. Adrian dropped the sculpture, collapsing beside Victor's lifeless body. His chest heaved as the weight of what he had done began to sink in. The once grand mansion was now silent, save for the heavy thudding of Adrian's own heart. Victor was dead, and with him the relentless grip of control that had bound Adrian for so long. Minutes passed in a blur as Adrian sat there, numb, staring at the man he had once loved, the man who had become his captor. It wasn't supposed to end like this. He had wanted freedom, not death. But the reality of his actions now hung over him like a shadow he couldn't escape. The blood on his hands, the fractured pieces of his life. All of it had spiraled into something far darker than he could have ever imagined. The weight of the night pressed down on him, suffocating. Adrian knew he couldn't stay in that house. He had to leave, to get away from the scene, from Victor's lifeless body, from the memories that had turned this mansion into a prison. But where could he go? What future awaited him after this? With trembling hands, Adrian gathered his belongings. The bag he had packed days before, hidden in the studio, meant for an escape that no longer felt possible. He moved through the mansion in a daze, his mind refusing to process what had just happened. But the image of Victor's cold, unblinking eyes was seared into his memory forever. As he stepped outside into the freezing night, the mansion loomed behind him like a tomb, silent and empty, haunted by the violence it had witnessed. Adrian had broken free. But at what cost? The price had been blood, and the weight of that price would follow him for the rest of his life. Hours later, as the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, Adrian knew the truth. There would be no escape from what he had done. No matter how far he ran, the memory of Victor's death, the obsession and control that had driven him to this moment, would haunt him forever. After Victor Halstead's tragic death, Adrian Cole disappeared, his whereabouts unknown. The story of their marriage, once the talk of the town, became something far more sinister, a tale of control, obsession, and a love that ended in murder. Those who knew them were left stunned by the unraveling of what had seemed like the perfect relationship. In the end, the web of lies and secrets that bound them together tore everything apart. And as the shadows of that night lingered, it became clear. Sometimes the darkest dangers lie not in the outside world, but within the walls of our own homes.